The first grave was dug in early spring, just as the last stubborn patches of snow were yielding to the pale green shoots of new grass. A small grave for young Martha Slocum, barely 7 years old, taken by a raging fever that had swept through her small body with terrifying speed. Her parents, Jed and Sarah Slocum, stood numbly beside the raw earth, the wind whipping Sarah's thin shawl around her grieving shoulders. The other settlers of Redemption Creek gathered a respectful distance away, their faces grim, shadowed by a fear that had begun to whisper through their small, isolated community. Redemption Creek. The name had sounded so hopeful when they'd chosen it, a collection of 30 or so families who had journeyed west together, seeking fertile land, clean air, and a chance to build a new life free from the crowded cities and worn-out farms back east. They had found their valley, nestled beside a clear-running creek, timber on the nearby bluffs, rich soil that promised good harvests. They'd built their cabins, a small church, a general store run by the capable widow Thornton, and a sturdy sheriff's office for their elected lawman, Sheriff Ben Carter, a quiet, steady man they trusted. They had a doctor, too, Dr. Elijah Hayes. Dr. Hayes was young, barely 30, but he possessed a keen mind, skilled hands, and a dedication that belied his years. He'd arrived with the first wave of settlers, his small black bag filled with not just instruments and medicines, but with a fierce determination to protect the health of this fledgling community. He'd treated their injuries, delivered their babies, nursed them through the usual frontier ailments. But this new sickness, this was different. It started with a cough, then a fever that climbed relentlessly, a rash that spread like wildfire across the skin, delirium, and then, too often, the rattling breath that signaled the end. It moved with terrifying speed, striking down the young and the old, the strong and the frail, with seeming indifference. After Martha Slocum, there was old Jedediah Miller, then young Mrs. Peterson, then 2 of the Johnson children. The small, hand-hewn crosses began to multiply on the little rise overlooking the valley, a stark, growing testament to their vulnerability. Redemption Creek was no longer a place of promise. It was a place of fear, fighting for its very survival against an invisible, relentless enemy. Dr. Elijah Hayes worked tirelessly, his face growing gaunter, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and a dawning, desperate frustration. He rode from cabin to cabin, his horse lathered, dispensing what remedies he had: quinine for the fevers, poultices for the chest, soothing teas for the coughs. He recognized the symptoms, of course. It looked like a particularly virulent strain of measles, or perhaps smallpox, though the rash was atypical for the latter. He'd seen outbreaks back east during his training, but never anything that spread so rapidly, with such devastating effect, in such an isolated community. Where had it come from? How was it spreading? He quarantined the sick as best he could, ordered clothes and bedding burned, urged meticulous cleanliness, but the sickness continued its grim march, seemingly unstoppable. His modern medical knowledge, the textbooks he'd studied so diligently, felt pitifully inadequate against this relentless foe. He was one man, with limited supplies, fighting a shadow. The settlers, initially looking to Dr. Hayes with desperate hope, began to succumb to a deeper fear, a fear that sometimes curdled into suspicion, then anger. Why couldn't the doctor stop it? Were his medicines not strong enough? Was he missing something? Whispers started, fueled by grief and terror. Some blamed the creek water, though Hayes had tested it and found it clear. Others looked towards the small band of Pawnee who occasionally traded with the settlement, muttering about Indian sickness, though the Pawnee themselves seemed healthy and had kept their distance since the outbreak began. A few even cast suspicious glances towards the widow Thornton's general store, wondering if the sickness had arrived with the last supply wagon from the distant railhead town of Fort Kearney. Fear, like a contagion itself, began to infect the community's spirit, fraying the bonds of trust and cooperation that were their greatest strength. Sheriff Carter did his best to maintain order, to quiet the more outlandish rumors, but he too felt the heavy weight of helplessness, his authority useless against an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't fight with a gun. It was Sarah Slocum, Martha's grieving mother, who perhaps felt the doctor's burden most keenly, yet also harbored a sliver of a different kind of hope. or perhaps just a different perspective. Sarah wasn't like some of the other women, content to rely solely on Dr. Hayes's pronouncements. She had grown up with a grandmother who knew the old ways, the lore of plants and herbs, remedies passed down through generations. While she respected Dr. Hayes's education, she also felt a deep connection to the land, a belief in its own healing powers, if one knew where to look, how to listen. After Martha's death, Sarah had withdrawn, consumed by grief. But now, seeing the sickness continue its rampage, seeing the doctor's growing despair, a new resolve began to stir within her. She remembered her grandmother's words about feverfew and lungwort, about specific barks and roots that could cool fevers and ease breathing. But many of those plants didn't grow readily on the open prairie around Redemption Creek. They were found higher up, in the more sheltered, wooded ravines of the bluffs that bordered the valley, or deeper in the timber along the creek, places few of the settlers frequented. One evening, as Dr. Hayes sat exhausted in his small cabin that served as both home and surgery, staring bleakly at his dwindling supply of quinine and carbolic acid, there was a hesitant knock at his door. It was Sarah Slocum. Her face was pale, her eyes still shadowed by grief, but there was a new light in them, a spark of determination. In her hands, she held a small, carefully wrapped bundle. "Doctor," she said quietly, her voice surprisingly steady, I know you're doing all you can, but my grandmother, she taught me about certain plants, for fevers, for the lungs." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing a collection of fresh leaves, roots, and dried berries. "I found these, up in the bluffs. Maybe they could help, alongside your medicines?" Dr. Hayes looked at the offering, his first instinct a weary dismissal. He was a man of science, trained in modern medicine. Folk remedies, herbal concoctions, they were unreliable, often dangerous. He had enough to contend with without adding unknown variables. But then he looked at Sarah Slocum's earnest, hopeful face, remembered the helplessness he felt watching her daughter die, and something shifted within him. His own methods weren't working. His knowledge felt insufficient. What did he have to lose by trying something, anything, different? Perhaps there was wisdom in the old ways, knowledge he had dismissed too readily in his reliance on textbooks and formal training. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Tell me about them. Show me how your grandmother prepared them." It was a small act of humility, a willingness to consider help from an unexpected quarter. And it was perhaps the first turning point in Redemption Creek's desperate battle. But the real help, the truly mysterious aid, was yet to arrive, coming not from within the community, but from the deep, silent wilderness that surrounded them, borne on the wind like a whisper of forgotten lore. As Dr. Hayes and Sarah Slocum began to cautiously incorporate some of the traditional herbal remedies into the treatment of the sick willow bark for fever, mullein tea for coughs, poultices of comfrey and plantain for skin lesions, they saw, or perhaps desperately willed themselves to see, slight improvements in some patients. The fevers didn't break dramatically, the coughs didn't vanish overnight, but there seemed to be a subtle easing of symptoms in a few cases, a flicker of returning strength where before there had been only relentless decline. It was enough to offer a fragile tendril of hope. But the sickness, whatever its true nature, was cunning, adaptable. Just as one symptom seemed to lessen, another would flare up. New cases continued to appear, often in cabins previously untouched. The quarantine measures Dr. Hayes had implemented seemed porous, ineffective. The invisible enemy was always a step ahead. The community remained gripped by fear, the initial hope brought by Sarah's herbs quickly overshadowed by fresh waves of illness and new graves dug on the windswept hill. Dr. Hayes redoubled his efforts, pushing himself to the brink of collapse. He studied his medical texts late into the night by flickering lamplight, searching for answers, for parallels, for anything that might explain the strange progression of the disease, its relentless tenacity. He meticulously documented symptoms, timelines, responses to treatments, both his own and Sarah's, trying to discern a pattern. He began to suspect this wasn't a single disease, but perhaps a complex of infections, or something that weakened the body's defenses, leaving it vulnerable to multiple assailants. He also grew increasingly convinced that the source wasn't just person-to-person contagion. There had to be an environmental factor, something in the air, the water, the soil itself, that was fueling the epidemic, keeping it alive in their isolated valley. But what? And how could he find it, let alone combat it, with his limited resources? His investigation led him to focus more intently on the creek that gave the settlement its name and its lifeblood. Redemption Creek. Clear, cold, flowing down from the higher timbered country to the north. All the settlers drew their water from it, or from shallow wells dug near its banks. He had tested it initially, found it clean. But that was before the sickness truly took hold. Could something have changed? Was there contamination upstream, beyond the settlement's immediate vicinity? He had no way of knowing, no means to conduct a thorough survey of the creek's entire course through the rugged, unfamiliar territory. It was during one of his increasingly desperate solitary rides along the creek bank, searching for any sign of unusual discoloration, odor, or dead wildlife that might indicate contamination, that he first became aware of him, or rather, of his signs. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched, a prickle on the back of his neck that made him glance over his shoulder, seeing nothing but rustling leaves and shadows among the cottonwoods. Then, he began to find things. Small, subtle things, easily missed if one wasn't looking, or didn't know what to look for. A carefully constructed small dam of rocks in a shallow tributary, diverting the main flow slightly, perhaps allowing sediment to settle. Further upstream, near a marshy area thick with cattails, he found evidence of recent deep digging, as if someone had been clearing a spring or trying to improve drainage. And then, the offerings. Left on a flat rock near a particularly clear pool in the creek, a place Hayes often stopped to rest his horse and refill his canteen, he found a small bundle of unfamiliar herbs, neatly tied with a strip of sinew. They were not plants Sarah Slocum had shown him, not plants he recognized from his medical texts. They had a strange, pungent, slightly medicinal aroma. He hesitated. Then, driven by a mixture of curiosity and desperation, he took them. Later, examining them in his surgery, he tentatively identified one as a type of potent wild ginger, known in some old herbals for its purifying properties. These signs continued, appearing sporadically over the next few weeks. A different bundle of herbs left near a cabin where a child was particularly ill. A deadfall trap, expertly set to catch small game, discovered near the settlement's edge, the catch a brace of plump rabbits, left untouched, clearly intended as a gift. Tracks, not of shod horses or settlers' boots, but the faint, almost invisible print of moccasins, or perhaps feet wrapped in hide, found near the creek bank, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. Dr. Hayes was baffled, intrigued, and more than a little unnerved. Who was leaving these things? Why? Was it one of the Pawnee, trying to offer help in their own way, despite the settlers' underlying fear of them? But the signs felt different, more deliberate, more knowing. The herbs were often specific, targeted. The improvements to the creek seemed designed to protect the water quality. It was as if someone was observing the settlement's plight from afar, understanding their needs, and offering quiet, anonymous assistance. A guardian angel? Or something far more complex? He mentioned his findings to no one at first, not even Sarah Slocum. The community was already on edge. Talk of a mysterious benefactor, especially one who moved like a ghost and left strange herbs, might only fuel more fear, more wild speculation. Silas Croft back in Promise Valley might have used it to sow discord, but here in Redemption Creek, there was no obvious internal antagonist like Croft stirring the pot, only the pervasive fear of the unknown. Dr. Hayes kept his own counsel, observing, wondering. The help, whatever its source, seemed to make a difference, however small. Combined with Sarah's remedies and Hayes's own increasingly targeted treatments, the tide of the epidemic seemed to slow, just slightly. Fewer new cases appeared. Some of the gravely ill began to show signs of rallying, but the sickness was far from defeated. It still flared up unexpectedly, claim new victims, kept the settlement teetering on the brink. Then came the incident with the spoiled flour. A supply wagon from Fort Kearny, long overdue, finally struggled into Redemption Creek, bringing desperately needed provisions, including sacks of flour. Relief swept through the community, but within days of the new flour being distributed and used, a fresh, violent wave of stomach sickness struck, affecting nearly every household that had baked with it. Dr. Hayes, already stretched thin, was overwhelmed. He quickly identified the flour as the likely culprit. It had a strange, slightly sour smell he hadn't noticed initially. But what was wrong with it? Had it been improperly stored? Contaminated during transit? Or was it something more sinister? It was then that the mysterious helper intervened more directly, more urgently. Late one night, Hayes, asleep from sheer exhaustion in his chair, was awakened by a soft scratching at his cabin door. He opened it to find no one there, but lying on his doorstep was a small leather pouch. Inside, he found a handful of charred, blackened wheat grains and a single, crudely drawn picture on a piece of scraped hide. The picture depicted a stalk of wheat, but with strange, dark, spur-like growths on the kernels. Ergot, poisonous fungus that could grow on rye or wheat, especially if damp or improperly stored. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and severe gastrointestinal distress, symptoms mirroring many of those now ravaging the settlement. Hayes stared at the drawing, at the charred grains, a cold dread washing over him. He hadn't considered ergot. It was rare, something he'd only read about. But the symptoms, they fit. And the flour. He remembered Widow Thornton mentioning the wagon had been delayed by heavy rains, some of the sacks arriving damp. He rushed to the store, woke the widow, examined the remaining flour sacks by lantern light. Sure enough, many of the grains had the telltale dark spurs. The sickness wasn't just one thing. It was a complex brew, exacerbated now by accidental mass poisoning. But who had known? Who had recognized the signs of ergot and left the warning? The drawing was crude but specific. The charred grains a clear indication of how to neutralize the poison. Heat destroyed the toxins. This wasn't just random kindness. This was specific, life-saving knowledge. The next morning, guided by this new understanding, Hayes instructed the settlers to bake all remaining flour thoroughly, or discard it if it seemed too heavily contaminated. He also remembered another remedy for ergotism: strong, bitter coffee, or teas made from certain astringent barks, which could help counteract the toxins. He shared this with Sarah Slocum, who immediately recognized some of the barks from her grandmother's lore. Working together, they began treating the newly afflicted, and slowly, painstakingly, this latest wave of sickness began to subside. Dr. Hayes knew he had to find the person who had left the warning. This anonymous benefactor possessed knowledge that could be crucial to the settlement's survival, knowledge that went beyond traditional herbalism. He began actively searching, riding further up the creek, leaving small offerings of tobacco or trinkets in places where he'd found previous signs, hoping to draw his helper out. His efforts were rewarded, though not in the way he expected. One afternoon, while examining a series of small, almost invisible check dams built across a feeder stream miles above the settlement, dams clearly designed to filter impurities from the water before it reached Redemption Creek, he felt that familiar prickle of being watched. He turned slowly. Standing silently at the edge of a dense thicket of willow and chokecherry, almost invisible in his buckskins and dappled sunlight, was a man. He was not Pawnee, though his features held the strong, high cheekbones and dark, observant eyes often associated with native peoples. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, his face deeply lined, weathered like ancient rock, his long dark hair streaked with gray, braided and adorned with a single hawk feather. He carried no visible weapon, only a staff made from a gnarled piece of driftwood. His stillness was absolute, his gaze direct, holding a profound, ancient wisdom and an almost palpable sadness. He did not look surprised to see Hayes. He looked like he had been expecting him. "You," Dr. Hayes breathed, his heart pounding. "You're the one." Jonas? He used the name the settlers had whispered, though he had no idea if it was correct. The man did not confirm or deny the name. He simply nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Hayes's face. The herbs, Hayes continued. The deer, the warning about the flower. It was all you? Another slow nod. Why? Hayes asked, the question bursting out. Why help us? And why in secret? The stranger remained silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over Hayes, then out towards the distant valley where Redemption Creek lay huddled. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, raspy, like wind through dry leaves, carrying the accent of someone who rarely used English. This land, it remembers, he said, his words measured, cryptic. It remembers sickness, remembers healing. Some listen, some forget. He tapped his chest lightly. My people listened long ago. Your people? Hayes asked, intrigued. Are you Ute? Cheyenne? Arapaho? The stranger shook his head. No tribe you name. We were walkers of the old paths, keepers of the balance. Before your iron horse, before your towns, we knew the plants that heal, the waters that cleanse, the spirits that guard this land. A profound sorrow shadowed his eyes. Most are gone now, scattered, forgotten, like the old ways. But you remember, Hayes stated, understanding dawning. This man wasn't just a skilled woodsman. He was a repository of ancient, forgotten knowledge, a healer in his own tradition. Some things cannot be forgotten, the stranger replied. He looked directly at Hayes then, his gaze piercing. Your people bring new sickness, sickness born of carelessness, crowding, disrespect for the land, the flower, of fool's poison. Your medicines fight symptoms, sometimes win, sometimes lose, but the source remains. He gestured towards the creek. The water carries memory, carries life, carries sickness. You must learn to read its story. Dr. Hayes felt a sense of profound humility. This man, this savage, as some in the town might call him, possessed a depth of understanding about health, about the interconnectedness of life and the environment, that made Hayes's formal medical training feel narrow, incomplete. Can you teach me? Hayes asked, his voice earnest. Can you help us understand? Help us heal this valley for good? The stranger considered him for a long moment. Perhaps, he said finally, if you are willing to listen, not just with your ears, but with your spirit, the land speaks. Few now know its language. He turned. Come, I will show you things your books do not contain. And so began an unlikely alliance. Dr. Elijah Hayes, the man of Western science, and the enigmatic stranger, the keeper of ancient indigenous wisdom, began to work together in secret to save Redemption Creek. The stranger, who Hayes eventually learned was called Nocona by the few scattered remnants of his people, a name meaning wanderer or he who walks alone, began to share his knowledge. He showed Hayes how to identify subtle signs of contamination in the water, how to use specific clays and charcoals to filter it, how to find and prepare plants that not only treated symptoms but strengthened the body's own defenses. He explained the importance of seasonal cycles, of respecting the balance of nature, of understanding how human actions, damming streams, overgrazing, poor sanitation, could disrupt that balance and invite disease. Hayes, in turn, began to see the limitations of his own approach. He realized that his focus on treating individual illnesses, on battling specific pathogens, often missed the larger picture, the underlying environmental and social factors that contributed to poor health. Nocona's holistic perspective, his understanding of the deep connection between the land, the water, the animals, and human well-being, opened Hayes's eyes to a new, more comprehensive vision of healing. They worked discreetly. Nocona would never enter the settlement itself, fearing the settlers' ingrained prejudice and suspicion. Instead, he met Hayes in the wilderness, guiding him, teaching him. Hayes then translated Nocona's wisdom into practical actions the settlers could understand and implement, often framing it in terms of hygiene, sanitation, or sensible preventative measures, without revealing the full source of his new insights. He organized work parties to clean up the creek banks, to dig deeper, safer wells away from potential runoff, to improve waste disposal. He encouraged the planting of specific herbs and vegetables Nocona identified as beneficial. He taught Sarah Slocum and other women how to prepare some of Nocona's remedies, combining them with his own medical treatments. Slowly, painstakingly, the health of Redemption Creek began to improve. The outbreaks became less frequent, less severe. The children grew stronger. The fear in the valley began to recede, replaced by a cautious, growing optimism. Dr. Hayes found his own medical knowledge enhanced, deepened by Nocona's ancient wisdom. He learned that true healing wasn't just about fighting disease. It was about fostering balance, resilience, harmony with the natural world. But their secret alliance was not without its own dangers. There were still those in the settlement, like Jed Slocum, Martha's father, who remained bitter and suspicious after his daughter's death, who distrusted Hayes's new methods, who muttered about Indian magic or unchristian practices when they saw him encouraging the use of unfamiliar herbs or advocating for changes in their traditional ways of living. And always, there was the underlying fear of the unknown, the fear of the wilderness and its native inhabitants, a prejudice deeply ingrained in many of the settlers. If Nocona's role were discovered, if the town knew their beloved doctor was consorting with and learning from a savage, the fragile peace Hayes had worked so hard to build could shatter instantly. The real test wasn't just battling the epidemic. It was battling the ingrained fears and prejudices of the very people they were trying to save. The truce with the epidemic proved fragile. Just as Redemption Creek began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, feeling the worst was behind them, a new, more terrifying threat emerged, not from within, but from without, carried on the dusty hooves of riders who brought with them not supplies, but avarice and the cold shadow of power. Word of redemption. Creek's fertile valley, its clear water, and its small but resilient community had eventually reached the ears of men who saw not a haven for settlers, but an opportunity for exploitation. A powerful cattle baron from downstate, a man named Josiah King, known for his ruthless expansion and his disregard for small homesteaders who stood in his way, decided Redemption Creek and its surrounding lands would make a fine addition to his growing empire. He needed the water for his vast herds, the valley for winter grazing. The fact that it was already settled, already claimed by families who had poured their sweat and hopes into it, meant nothing to him. King didn't arrive himself, not at first. He sent his foreman, a brutal, hard-bitten man named Caleb Thorne, no direct relation to the Dr. Thorne of Jedediah Miles's past, but perhaps cut from the same cruel cloth, a common enough name for a certain type of man. Thorne rode into Redemption Creek one afternoon with a dozen rough-looking, heavily armed riders, his manner arrogant, his eyes cold and assessing. He made no pretense of friendship. He announced to Sheriff Carter and a hastily gathered group of anxious settlers that Josiah King had acquired title to the entire valley and surrounding lands through some dubious territorial claim bought from speculators back east. The settlers had 1 month to vacate, period. No negotiation, no compensation beyond a token amount for their improvements. Outrage and disbelief swept through Redemption Creek. They had deeds, filed legally. They had built their homes, planted their crops, buried their dead here. This was their land, bought with hardship and hope. How could this cattle baron simply claim it? Sheriff Carter, though clearly outmanned and outgunned, stood firm, refusing to acknowledge King's claim, vowing to protect the settlers' rights. Dr. Hayes, John Miller, from a previous tale, let's assume this is a different John Miller, perhaps a community elder here, and Sarah Slocum rallied the community, urging them to stand together, to resist this blatant land grab. Caleb Thorne just laughed, a harsh, contemptuous sound. Rights? Your rights end where Mr. King's begin, sodbusters. You got a month. Be smart. Take the offer. Or my boys and I will clear this valley for you, one way or another. He and his men set up a rough camp just outside the settlement, a visible, menacing presence, their intentions clear. The settlers were caught in a desperate vice. They had just survived a devastating epidemic, their resources depleted, their spirits weary. Now they faced a new, more tangible enemy, one that threatened to destroy everything they had worked for, everything they had endured. Some argued for leaving, for taking King's meager offer and seeking peace elsewhere, unwilling to face more conflict, more loss. Others, led by John Miller and fueled by righteous anger, vowed to fight, to defend their homes and their land, even against overwhelming odds. Dr. Hayes found himself in a difficult position. His primary concern was the health and well-being of the community. Another conflict, especially a violent one, would inevitably lead to more suffering, more death. Yet to simply surrender, to allow King's injustice to prevail, felt like a betrayal of everything they had built. It was during this time of rising tension and desperate debate that Nocona reappeared, not with herbs or warnings about water, but with a different kind of offering. He sought out Dr. Hayes late one night, materializing like a shadow at the edge of Hayes's cabin. "The cattlemen," Nocona said, his voice low, his eyes troubled. "They are a sickness too, a sickness of greed. They poison the land, drive away the game, leave nothing but dust." He had seen King's herds before, knew their destructive power. "We know," Hayes replied wearily. "But what can we do? They have guns, numbers. We are few and tired." Nocona was silent for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the small, vulnerable settlement huddled in the darkness. "This valley, it has defenses," he said finally. "Not of guns alone. The land itself can fight, if you know how to use it." He spoke of narrow passes that could be blocked, of hidden springs King's men wouldn't find, of strategies for a protracted resistance that relied not on direct confrontation, but on attrition, on making the valley too costly, too difficult for King to hold. He even hinted at alliances, other small bands of native peoples further in the mountains who also feared King's encroachment, who might be persuaded to help defend this valley if it meant protecting their own ancestral lands. Dr. Hayes listened, stunned. Nocona wasn't just a healer of physical ailments. He was a strategist, a man who understood warfare, who knew this land in ways the settlers, and certainly King's men, never could. The offer was a lifeline, but also a dangerous escalation. Accepting Nocona's help, especially if it involved alliances with other native groups, would undoubtedly be seen by King, and perhaps by the distant territorial authorities, as an act of open rebellion, possibly even savagery. It could bring even greater retribution down upon them. Yet what was the alternative? Slow starvation and surrender, or a swift, bloody, and likely futile direct confrontation with Thorne's riders? The decision tore at Hayes. He consulted with Sheriff Carter and John Miller. Carter, a man of the law, was deeply reluctant to engage in what might be seen as guerrilla warfare, or to ally with wild Indians. Miller, however, driven by desperation and a growing respect for Nocona's wisdom, gleaned indirectly through Hayes, argued passionately for accepting any help they could get. "Our deeds and our laws mean nothing to King," Miller declared. "We fight with what we have, or we lose everything." Sarah Slocum, surprisingly, also voiced support for Nocona's implied offer. Her grief had not broken her spirit. It had forged a fierce protectiveness for this community, for the memory of her daughter. "Dr. Hayes," she said quietly, "Nocona saved many of us from the sickness. He understands this land. Maybe he understands this new threat too. We trusted his medicine. Can we not trust his wisdom now?" The debate raged. Meanwhile, Caleb Thorne and his men grew more impatient, their provocations more blatant. They diverted a section of Redemption Creek upstream, reducing the flow of water to the settlement's fields. They ran off some of the settlers' few remaining livestock. Shots were exchanged one tense afternoon when a group of Thorne's riders deliberately rode through a newly planted field, trampling young crops. Miraculously, no one was seriously hurt, but the incident brought the conflict to a knife's edge. Time was running out. A decision had to be made. Dr. Hayes sought out Nocona again, finding him waiting, as always, in their secluded meeting place by the creek. Hayes laid out the dilemma, the fears, the divisions within the community. Nocona listened patiently, his ancient eyes holding no judgment. Fear is a strong current, Nakona said when Hayes had finished. It can sweep away reason. But courage is a deeper spring. This valley chose its name. Promise. A promise is a vow. To the land. To each other. To the future. Such vows are not easily broken. Not by sickness. Not by men of greed. He looked at Hayes. The choice is yours. Fight your way, die quickly, or fight our way, the way of the land, and perhaps live and keep your promise. Nakona then revealed more of his plan. Not just defensive tactics, but a way to expose King's illegal claim, to bring pressure from outside. He spoke of ancient trails leading through the mountains to other settlements, even to distant forts, trails King's men wouldn't know. He suggested sending riders, swift, silent riders, guided by him or his hidden allies, to carry word of King's aggression, to seek help from territorial authorities less easily swayed by King's influence, perhaps even to deliver evidence of King's past land grabs and brutalities, evidence Nakona seemed to possess or know how to acquire. It was a desperate gamble, relying on speed, stealth, and the hope that justice, however slow, might still exist beyond Redemption Creek. The emotional twist wasn't a betrayal, but a profound shift in strategy, a choice between two desperate paths. It was the offer of an unexpected, dangerous alliance, moving beyond just healing the sick to actively fighting an external, powerful human enemy. It forced Dr. Hayes and the settlers to confront their deepest prejudices, to weigh the risks of unconventional warfare against the certainty of annihilation if they did nothing, or fought conventionally. It was a choice that would redefine their relationship with Nakona, with the land itself, and ultimately, with their own understanding of what it meant to fight for their homes, their community, their promise. The frontier doctor wasn't just battling an epidemic anymore. Aided by his unknown hero, he was now facing a war, with the fate of Redemption Creek hanging precariously in the balance. The decision was agonizing, dividing the small community. Sheriff Carter, bound by his oath to uphold the law, however inadequate it seemed, was deeply troubled by the idea of extra-legal actions, of allying with unknown native bands, of sending messengers on what seemed like a suicide mission. He argued for trying to reason with Caleb Thorne, for appealing to the distant territorial governor, for patience. But patience felt like a luxury Redemption Creek couldn't afford. Caleb Thorne's provocations grew daily, his riders becoming more aggressive, openly contemptuous. They dammed another section of the creek, almost completely cutting off the water supply to the lower fields where most of the newly planted crops struggled. They set fire to an outlying abandoned cabin, a clear message of intimidation. The air crackled with tension, fear, and simmering rage. John Miller, Sarah Slocum, and a growing number of the younger, more desperate settlers argued vehemently for Nakona's plan. They had seen the failure of conventional approaches against the epidemic. They had little faith that King's power could be challenged through official channels that King himself likely controlled or influenced. "We fight fire with fire, Sheriff," Miller declared during one heated town meeting in the small church, the only building large enough to hold them all. "Or we burn. Nakona offers us a chance, a slim one maybe, but it's more than Thorne or King will ever offer us." Dr. Hayes found himself at the center of the storm. He understood Carter's adherence to the law, his fear of unleashing uncontrollable forces. But he had also witnessed Nakona's wisdom, his profound connection to the land, his quiet determination. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that Caleb Thorne and Josiah King would not be swayed by reason or appeals to justice. They responded only to power, or to obstacles that made their conquest too costly. Finally, after a particularly egregious act by Thorne's men, they deliberately drove a small herd of stolen cattle through the settlement's main street, trampling gardens, terrifying children, and openly mocking Sheriff Carter's attempts to stop them. The tide turned. Even Carter, his face white with fury and frustrated impotence, had to admit that their current path was leading only to humiliation and eventual destruction. "All right, Hayes," Carter said grimly later that night, meeting with Hayes and Miller in the sheriff's office. "All right, tell your friend, Nakona, tell him we'll listen. But if this goes wrong, if innocent blood is shed because of this, It's on all our heads. Dr. Hayes relayed the decision to Nokona. The old healer listened, his expression unchanged, but Hayes thought he saw a flicker of something. Respect? Approval? In his ancient eyes. Nokona then laid out the details of his strategy. It was twofold. First, a campaign of harassment and attrition within the valley, using knowledge of the terrain to make Thorne's occupation increasingly difficult and costly, while avoiding direct, large-scale confrontation. Small raiding parties, led by men Nokona trusted, scouts from a small displaced band of Ute who had found refuge deeper in the mountains and harbored their own grievances against encroaching cattlemen, would target Thorne's supply lines, run off his horses, create diversions, make his men feel constantly watched, constantly vulnerable. The aim was not to defeat Thorne's riders in open battle, but to wear them down, fray their nerves, make the valley an uncomfortable, unprofitable hornet's nest. Second, and more crucially, was the mission to get word out, to bring external pressure on Josiah King. Nokona knew of a hidden, almost forgotten trail, a high mountain pass that led eastward, bypassing the main routes controlled or watched by King's allies. It was dangerous, passable only by men on foot or with sure-footed mountain ponies, but it could cut days, perhaps weeks, off the journey to Fort Laramie, the nearest major military post and telegraph station not under King's immediate influence. Nokona proposed sending 2 riders, one a trusted young Ute scout named Little Hawk, known for his speed and endurance, the other a settler, someone who could speak credibly to the authorities. They would carry letters from Sheriff Carter detailing King's aggression and illegal claims, and if possible, any tangible proof they could gather. Nokona also hinted he possessed certain documents, old treaties, land grants from Spanish times that might challenge the very foundation of King's territorial title, documents he had kept hidden for years, waiting perhaps for a moment like this. He would entrust these to the messengers. The choice of the settler rider fell, surprisingly, on Lydia Carter, the sheriff's own daughter. She was young, yes, barely 17 now, but she was a superb horsewoman, knew the foothills almost as well as Nokona, and possessed a quiet courage and determination that had impressed everyone during the epidemic and the initial confrontations with Thorne's men. She volunteered fiercely, arguing that she was less likely to be seen as a direct threat than one of the men, perhaps able to use her youth and apparent innocence to her advantage if stopped. Sheriff Carter, after much agonizing, reluctantly agreed, seeing the fire in his daughter's eyes, recognizing her capability, and perhaps also wanting his own blood invested in this desperate gamble. Dr. Hayes, though worried for her safety, knew she was a strong choice. Preparations were made in secret, under the cover of darkness. Nokona provided Little Hawk and Lydia with swift mountain ponies, trail rations, and detailed instructions for the perilous journey. He gave them a small, carefully wrapped deerskin pouch containing his precious documents and Sheriff Carter's letters. Dr. Hayes added a letter of his own, detailing the medical impact of King's siege on the community, appealing for humanitarian aid. Sarah Slocum and Mary Miller, John Miller's wife, not the Mary Miller from the previous tale of Promise Valley, though sharing a common resilience, stitched hidden pockets into their clothes for the documents, prayed over them, and packed them with what meager supplies they could spare. The night before their departure, Dr. Hayes found Nokona sitting alone on a bluff overlooking the moonlit valley, a solitary, timeless figure. "Are you sure about this, Nokona?" Hayes asked quietly. "Trusting these old papers, these young riders, against a man like King?" Nokona looked out at the land, his gaze profound. "The truth is a strong seed, Doctor," he said softly. "Sometimes it lies dormant for many winters. But when the right rain falls, the right sun shines. It can break through even the hardest ground. These riders carry that seed. And these mountains? They have their own ways of protecting those who walk the true path." He turned to Hayes. "Your part now is here. Keep your people strong. Keep the fires lit. Make this valley a hard stone for King to swallow." Under the cloak of a moonless night, Lydia Carter and Little Hawk slipped out of Redemption Creek, guided by Nokona through the initial treacherous foothills then striking out on their own towards the distant legendary Eagle Pass. Their journey would be fraught with peril, harsh weather, difficult terrain, the risk of discovery by King's allies, or other unknown dangers. The fate of Redemption Creek, and perhaps much more, now rested on their young shoulders, and on the fragile hope that truth, carried by courageous messengers, could still prevail against entrenched power and greed. Back in Redemption Creek, the waiting began. A period of tense, nerve-wracking uncertainty, punctuated by Nakona's quiet war of attrition against Caleb Thorne's occupying force. True to his word, small, almost invisible acts of resistance began. Thorne's picket lines would be mysteriously cut, his horses found wandering miles from camp, their hobbles sliced. Sentries would report fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures in the woods, hear unnerving animal calls that sounded almost human, find their supplies tampered with, sugar mixed with salt, flour sacks slashed. Small things, but they accumulated, fraying nerves, creating an atmosphere of constant unease. Thorne's men, accustomed to bullying and open confrontation, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't engage directly. They grew jumpy, trigger-happy, their discipline eroding. Dr. Hayes, Sheriff Carter, and John Miller worked to keep the community united, focused, prepared for the inevitable retaliation. They organized watches, reinforced cabin defenses, stockpiled what little food and water they could. Sarah Slocum and Mary Miller tended to the sick and injured, mostly minor scrapes and anxieties now, but the ever-present threat of another epidemic outbreak, fueled by stress and deprivation, loomed large. Hayes continued his secret consultations with Nakona, learning more about the land, about sustainable living, about a different kind of strength that came not from guns, but from resilience, community, and harmony with the natural world. He began to understand that Nakona wasn't just fighting for Redemption Creek. He was fighting for the land itself, for a way of life threatened by the relentless encroachment of men like King. Caleb Thorne grew increasingly furious and frustrated. His attempts to provoke the settlers into an open fight failed. They remained defensively within their core settlement, refusing to be drawn out. His efforts to find and destroy Nakona, or his hidden Ute allies, were equally fruitless. They melted into the mountains like smoke, striking unexpectedly, then vanishing. Thorne's reports back to Josiah King became more desperate, painting a picture not of a swift, easy conquest, but of a costly, frustrating quagmire. He demanded more men, more resources, permission to take harsher measures against the recalcitrant settlers. Meanwhile, Lydia Carter and Little Hawk faced their own epic struggle. The journey through Eagle Pass was even more brutal than Nakona had warned. They battled blizzards at high altitude, navigated treacherous ice fields, forded freezing rivers, their small ponies struggling but enduring. Little Hawk's knowledge of the high country, his instinctive ability to find shelter and sustenance, proved invaluable. Lydia, pushed to her limits, discovered reserves of strength and endurance she never knew she possessed. Her initial fear of the stoic Ute scout slowly transformed into a deep respect and camaraderie, built on shared hardship and mutual reliance. They communicated through a mixture of broken English, sign language, and shared understanding, their bond transcending cultural differences, forged in the crucible of their desperate mission. They faced dangers, a close encounter with a grizzly bear, a near-fatal rock slide, the constant threat of frostbite and starvation. But the pouch containing Nakona's ancient documents and Sheriff Carter's letters remained safe, clutched close, their hope and Redemption Creek's only hope. Weeks passed in Redemption Creek, each day a small victory of survival, each night a tense vigil. The strain was immense. Food ran critically low. Ammunition for defense was carefully rationed. Tempers frayed. Some settlers began to lose hope, murmuring about surrender, about accepting King's terms, however harsh. It took all of John Miller's leadership, Sheriff Carter's steady resolve, and Dr. Hayes's quiet counsel, often informed by Nakona's wisdom, to hold the community together, to keep the spark of resistance alive. Then, one bleak morning, just as despair seemed ready to claim them, a lone rider was spotted approaching the valley, not from Caleb Thorne's camp, but from the east, from the direction Lydia and Little Hawk had taken. It wasn't one of theirs. The rider carried a U.S. Army dispatch case. Hope, sharp and almost painful, surged through Redemption Creek. Had their message gotten through? Was help finally arriving? Or was this just another crueler twist of fate? The entire settlement held its breath as the rider dismounted wearily at the sheriff's office, the fate of their promise hanging in the balance. The Army dispatch rider brought news that was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. Lydia Carter and Little Hawk had made it through Eagle Pass, against all odds. They had reached Fort Laramie, delivered their letters and Nakona's documents to the commanding officer, Colonel Miles Standish, a man known for his integrity and his impatience with land barons who stirred up trouble with native tribes. Colonel Standish, intrigued by the ancient Spanish land grants Nakona had provided, documents that seemed to predate and potentially invalidate many of the newer territorial claims, including Josiah King's, and alarmed by Sheriff Carter's report of King's aggression, had immediately dispatched a telegraph message to the territorial governor and the federal authorities in Washington. He had also sent a small cavalry patrol led by a young, ambitious lieutenant named Custer. No, not that Custer, let's call him Lieutenant Davies, to avoid historical confusion but maintain a sense of the era, to investigate the situation in Redemption Creek, and, if necessary, to restore order. The arrival of Lieutenant Davies and his 20 blue-coated troopers threw Caleb Thorne's camp into disarray. Thorne, caught completely off guard, blustered and protested, claiming the settlers were squatters and agitators, but Davies, armed with Colonel Standish's orders and clearly unimpressed by Thorne's rhetoric, informed him curtly that all hostilities were to cease pending a full investigation by territorial authorities. He established a neutral zone between Thorne's camp and Redemption Creek, effectively ending the siege, at least for now. Relief swept through Redemption Creek, but it was tempered with caution. The soldiers were a buffer, but not necessarily saviors. Their presence was temporary. The legal battle over the land rights, instigated by Nakona's documents, would likely be long and arduous, fought in distant courts where Josiah King's money and influence still held considerable sway. And King himself, though thwarted for the moment, was not a man to give up easily. He would undoubtedly retaliate through legal maneuvers, political pressure, or perhaps more direct, covert means. Lydia Carter and Little Hawk did not return with the cavalry. Colonel Standish, recognizing the value of their testimony and Little Hawk's knowledge of King's operations, gleaned from his people's long and bitter experience with the cattle baron, had sent them on to the territorial capital under escort to speak directly to the governor and federal land agents. Their journey was far from over. In Redemption Creek, an uneasy truce settled over the valley. Caleb Thorne and his men remained in their camp, sullen and resentful, but constrained by the army's presence. The settlers began the slow, difficult task of rebuilding, replanting, trying to recover from the ravages of the epidemic and the siege. Dr. Hayes, with Nakona's continued discreet guidance, worked to improve public health measures, focusing on sanitation, clean water, and preventative care. He also began meticulously documenting everything: the history of the settlement, the details of the epidemic, King's aggression, Nakona's contributions, preparing for the legal battles he knew lay ahead. He was no longer just a healer. He was becoming a historian, a chronicler of his community's struggle. Nakona remained elusive, a ghost in the mountains, but his influence was profound. The settlers, having witnessed the power of his ancient knowledge and his quiet courage, now looked towards the wilderness not just with fear, but with a newfound respect, a dawning understanding of the delicate balance between human endeavor and the natural world. They began to see the creek, the timber, the very soil, not just as resources to be exploited, but as living entities to be respected, understood, and protected. Nakona, the unknown hero, had not only helped them survive a physical epidemic, he had begun to heal a deeper sickness, their disconnection from the land itself. But the emotional twist, the one that truly tested the soul of Redemption Creek and Dr. Hayes himself, was yet to come. It arrived not with guns or soldiers, but in the form of a letter, delivered by a weary circuit preacher making his rounds. The letter was from a colleague of Hayes's back east, a doctor he had trained with, now working at a prestigious research institute. It contained news that was both devastating and, in a strange way, illuminating. The letter described a newly identified, highly contagious viral strain that had been causing sporadic, severe outbreaks in isolated communities across the country, a precursor, perhaps, to the great influenza pandemics that would sweep the globe in later years. The symptoms described, the high fever, the rash, the rapid respiratory decline, matched perfectly what Redemption Creek had endured. But then came the chilling part. The letter mentioned that certain experimental treatments being developed back east, treatments involving specific metallic compounds and alkaloids derived from, of all things, certain types of ergot fungus, had, in early trials, sometimes produced paradoxical effects. In some patients, they seemed to offer temporary relief. But in others, particularly if the dosage was miscalculated or the patient's underlying constitution was weak, these experimental compounds could actually mimic the symptoms of the disease, or even trigger a more virulent secondary infection, effectively turning the attempted cure into a new, more insidious form of the sickness itself. Dr. Hayes read the letter, his blood running cold. He thought back to his own desperate treatments during the height of the epidemic. He had used quinine, yes, but also calomel, a mercury compound, and some of his own experimental tinctures based on half-remembered lectures and frontier expedients, trying anything to staunch the tide of death. And the spoiled flower. The ergot poisoning had been a separate, identifiable event, yes. But what if some of his own well-intentioned but perhaps poorly understood remedies, administered to patients already weakened by the primary viral infection, had inadvertently contributed to their suffering, prolonged their illness, even pushed some over the edge? What if, in his desperate fight to heal, he had, unknowingly, partially become the source of the plague himself, not through malice like Dr. Finch in another tale, but through ignorance, desperation, and the flawed, incomplete medical knowledge of his time? The realization was a crushing blow, a burden of guilt far heavier than Josiah King's threats or the memory of the epidemic's victims. He hadn't been battling just one enemy, but potentially two, the virus and the unintended consequences of his own desperate interventions. Nakona's gentle, holistic approach, his focus on strengthening the body's natural defenses, on cleansing and balance, suddenly seemed not just wise, but profoundly, tragically prescient. Had Nakona suspected? Had his cryptic warnings about new sickness brought by carelessness been directed not just at the settlers' general way of life, but also perhaps at Hayes's own medical practices? This was the true emotional crucible for Dr. Hayes. Not the external fight against disease or greed, but the internal reckoning with his own limitations, his own potential for unintended harm despite his best intentions. It was a profound moment of humility, stripping away the last vestiges of professional pride, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that even a healer, armed with knowledge and compassion, can become an unwitting agent of suffering in a world where so much remains unknown. It also deepened his respect for Nakona immeasurably, recognizing that the old wanderer's wisdom was born not just of tradition, but perhaps of a far more ancient, intuitive understanding of the delicate balance of life and health. This painful self-discovery would shape Hayes's future, his approach to medicine, and his commitment to protecting Redemption Creek, not just from external threats, but from the hidden dangers of ignorance and unintended consequences. The battle for Redemption Creek was far from over, but its doctor had just faced his own darkest hour and emerged, not unscathed, but perhaps ultimately, a truer, wiser healer. The weight of this potential, unintended complicity settled heavily on Dr. Hayes's soul. He didn't share his horrifying suspicion with the community. They had suffered enough, and a confession based on speculation, however strong, would only breed more fear, more distrust, perhaps even shatter the fragile recovery they were experiencing. Instead, he redoubled his efforts to learn from Nakona, seeking out the old wanderer with a new urgency, a new humility. He questioned him more deeply about the properties of plants, about the body's natural rhythms, about the subtle signs of imbalance that preceded outright sickness. Nakona, sensing the shift in Hayes, the erosion of his professional certainty, and the dawning of a deeper understanding, shared his knowledge more freely, though always with that characteristic reserve, that sense of conveying wisdom almost too profound, too ancient for simple words. Hayes began to integrate Nakona's teachings more systematically into his practice, not abandoning his scientific training entirely, but tempering it with a new respect for natural remedies, for preventative care, for the body's innate capacity to heal if given the right support. He focused on improving nutrition, on ensuring clean water beyond just the immediate settlement, on teaching the settlers how to identify and use local medicinal plants responsibly. He became less a dispenser of drugs and more a teacher of health, a guardian of the valley's overall well-being, his approach evolving into a unique blend of frontier pragmatism, scientific knowledge, and ancient earth-based wisdom. His guilt remained, a private burden, but it fueled a fierce dedication to do better, to truly understand the complex dance of sickness and health. Meanwhile, the external pressures on Redemption Creek continued, albeit in different forms. Josiah King, though his initial military-style siege had been thwarted, did not give up his claim on the valley. He shifted his tactics from overt aggression to a more insidious campaign of legal maneuvering, political pressure, and economic strangulation. He hired powerful lawyers in the territorial capital to challenge the validity of Nakona's ancient land grants and the settlers' individual deeds. He used his considerable influence to block supply routes to Redemption Creek, making it difficult for Widow Thornton to restock her general store. He spread rumors about the hostile Indians supposedly allied with the settlers, trying to turn public opinion and territorial authorities against them. His aim was clear: to isolate Redemption Creek, to starve it out, to make life so untenable that the settlers would eventually be forced to abandon their homes, leaving the valley ripe for his taking. The small community, weary but resolute, dug in for a protracted fight. Sheriff Carter, with Dr. Hayes's quiet support and Nakona's unseen guidance, organized patrols to guard against further encroachment by King's men, who still lurked on the periphery, testing their defenses. John Miller led efforts to improve irrigation, to maximize crop yields from their limited arable land to achieve a greater degree of self-sufficiency. Sarah Slocum and Mary Miller organized the women, preserving food, caring for the children, maintaining the social fabric of the community with quiet strength and unwavering determination. They had survived the epidemic, survived the siege. They would not be broken by economic hardship or legal chicanery. News from Lydia Carter and Little Hawk in the territorial capital was infrequent, carried by occasional dispatch riders or travelers, but it was cautiously optimistic. Nakona's documents had indeed caused a stir, forcing a re-examination of many long-standing land claims. The governor, under pressure from federal authorities alerted by Colonel Standish, and perhaps wary of igniting a wider conflict with native tribes if King's aggressive expansion continued unchecked, seemed inclined to rule in favor of the settlers, or at least to delay any definitive judgment that would dispossess them. But King's lawyers were skilled, his influence pervasive. The legal battle dragged on, a war of attrition fought with paper and ink instead of guns, but no less critical to Redemption Creek's survival. During this period of uneasy stalemate, Nakona's role continued to evolve. He remained a figure of the wilderness, rarely seen directly, but his presence was a constant source of quiet support. He provided game when hunting was scarce. He warned of approaching storms or unusual animal movements that might signal danger. He shared his knowledge of edible wild plants, helping the settlers supplement their meager harvests. More profoundly, he began to share his stories, his people's ancient understanding of the land, not just with Hayes, but occasionally, through Hayes, with the wider community. He spoke of the interconnectedness of all living things, of the need to respect the rhythms of nature, of the spiritual significance of the mountains, the creek, the very soil they walked upon. His words, filtered through Hayes's more familiar language, began to resonate deeply with the settlers, offering not just practical survival tips, but a different way of seeing their place in the world, a deeper connection to the valley they now fought so fiercely to protect. They began to understand that promise wasn't just about fertile land or a new start. It was about living in harmony with that land, respecting its power, its spirit. Silas Croft, back in Promise Valley from a previous narrative, had been a straightforward villain, his greed obvious. Josiah King was a more insidious foe, his power operating through layers of lawyers, politicians, and hired guns, a distant, almost abstract force of destruction. Fighting him required a different kind of courage, a different kind of endurance. It required not just physical bravery, but moral stamina, unwavering faith in their cause, and a willingness to trust in the slow, often frustrating processes of justice, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that justice might fail them. The community also faced internal challenges. The long period of hardship, the constant uncertainty, took its toll. Old grievances sometimes resurfaced. Fear of King's retaliation led some to argue for compromise, for accepting a buyout, however unfair. Jed Slocum, still bitter and distrustful, occasionally tried to stir up resentment against Hayes's methods or Nokona's unseen influence, playing on old prejudices. It took all of Sheriff Carter's steady leadership, John Miller's passionate advocacy for unity, and Dr. Hayes's quiet, reasoned counsel to navigate these internal fractures, to remind people of what they had endured together, what they were fighting for. One late autumn evening, as the first snows of what threatened to be another hard winter began to dust the peaks, Dr. Hayes sat with Nokona by a small, hidden fire high on a bluff overlooking Redemption Creek. The valley below was quiet, the lights of the cabins like scattered embers in the vast darkness. "Will they make it, Nokona?" Hayes asked, the question weighing heavily on him. "Through another winter? Through King's relentless pressure? Is there enough hope left?" Nokona stared into the flames for a long time, his ancient face impassive. "Hope is not a thing you find, Doctor," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "It is a thing you make, every day, with every choice, with every act of courage, with every seed planted in hard ground." He picked up a glowing ember from the fire with a piece of hardened bark, holding it out. "This fire. It is small. The darkness around us is vast. But this small fire holds warmth, holds light, holds life. Your people. They have learned to tend their fire. They have learned to feed it with courage, with community, with respect for the land that sustains them." He looked at Hayes, his pale eyes seeming to see into the doctor's soul. "You helped them find that fire again, Doctor. You and the young ones who carried the truth across the mountains. And perhaps even an old wanderer who remembered the songs of the stones and the whispers of the wind." He gently placed the ember back in the fire. "The winter will be hard. The fight will be long. But the fire will not easily go out." Nokona's words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply with Hayes. He looked down at Redemption Creek, at the small, scattered lights that represented so much struggle, so much resilience, so much hope stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. The future was uncertain. Josiah King was a powerful enemy. The forces arrayed against them were formidable. But Nokona was right. They had found their fire. They had learned to tend it. And together, whatever came, they would face the darkness, armed not just with guns or laws, but with the enduring strength of community, the wisdom of the land, and the unwavering promise of a better tomorrow, a promise they now understood had to be earned, defended, and cherished every single day. The battle against the epidemic had been a crucible. The battle against Josiah King would be its true test, and Dr. Elijah Hayes, the frontier doctor, aided by his unknown hero and the resilient spirit of his people, was ready to meet it. The winter settled in, as harsh and unforgiving as Nokona had predicted. Snows came early, deep and persistent, isolating Redemption Creek once more. Though this time they were better prepared, their larders not full, but less empty than the year before, their spirits hardened by past trials and a grim, shared determination. Caleb Thorne's men, still camped on the periphery, made occasional probing forays, testing the settlement's defenses, but found Sheriff Carter's patrols vigilant, the settlers unwilling to be intimidated. The real battle, however, was being fought far away, in the dusty halls of the territorial capital, with depositions, legal briefs, and political maneuvering. Lydia Carter and Little Hawk remained in the capital, their youthful courage and clear testimony proving surprisingly effective against Josiah King's high-priced lawyers. Nakona's ancient documents, scrutinized by skeptical but increasingly intrigued land commissioners, presented a genuine challenge to the legitimacy of many of King's sweeping claims, not just in Redemption Creek, but across the territory. The Ute scout, Little Hawk, also provided damning first-hand accounts of King's brutal tactics against native tribes, his disregard for treaty boundaries, his history of violence and intimidation. A picture began to emerge of Josiah King, not as a respectable cattle baron, but as a ruthless opportunist whose empire was built on a foundation of deceit, coercion, and bloodshed. Back in Redemption Creek, Dr. Hayes found himself increasingly reliant on Nakona's wisdom, not just for medical matters, but for understanding the deeper currents of the conflict. The old wanderer, though rarely seen, seemed to possess an uncanny awareness of events beyond the valley. His knowledge gleaned from sources Hayes couldn't fathom, perhaps other isolated native bands, lone trappers, the subtle language of the wilderness itself. Nakona warned of King's attempts to bribe officials, to discredit Lydia and Little Hawk, to incite violence that could be blamed on the settlers or their supposed native allies. He advised caution, patience, and an unwavering adherence to the truth. "A lie runs fast," Nakona told Hayes during one of their clandestine meetings, "but the truth endures, like the mountains." The community, despite the hardships, held together. The shared struggle had forged a powerful sense of solidarity. They pooled resources, supported each other, found strength in their shared vulnerability. Sarah Slocum, her personal grief transformed into a fierce maternal protectiveness for the entire community, became a pillar of strength, her quiet resilience inspiring others. John Miller, ever the pragmatist, organized hunting parties that, guided by Nakona's subtle advice on game movements, managed to bring in enough meat to supplement their dwindling stores. Sheriff Carter, no longer just a reluctant lawman but a determined defender of his people, maintained a constant vigil, his quiet authority backed by the now unwavering support of the settlers. Dr. Hayes continued his work, his approach to medicine forever changed. He established a small infirmary, using both his scientific knowledge and the herbal remedies Nakona had taught him. He emphasized sanitation, nutrition, preventative care. He taught the settlers how to identify and prepare local medicinal plants, empowering them to take more responsibility for their own health. He became not just their doctor, but their teacher, their advocate, a man deeply humbled by his past potential for error, now fiercely committed to a more holistic, more compassionate form of healing. The guilt he carried for his unwitting role in exacerbating the earlier epidemic never fully left him, but it became a driving force, a constant reminder of the profound responsibility that came with the power to heal or to harm. The climax of their struggle arrived not with a bang, but with a series of legal decisions and political shifts in the territorial capital, precipitated by the evidence Lydia, Little Hawk, and Nakona's documents had brought to light. The territorial governor, facing mounting pressure from federal authorities, concerned about King's destabilizing influence and potential for inciting wider Indian wars, finally ruled against Josiah King on several key land claims, including the one encompassing Redemption Creek. Nakona's ancient Spanish grants were upheld, exposing King's title as fraudulent. Furthermore, a territorial grand jury, presented with evidence of King's strong-arm tactics and witness tampering, issued indictments against him and several of his key lieutenants, including Caleb Thorne. The news, when it finally reached Redemption Creek via a triumphant dispatch rider, none other than Lydia Carter herself, escorted by a small contingent of territorial marshals sent to enforce the governor's ruling and arrest Thorne, was met with stunned disbelief, then an explosion of joyous, tearful relief. They had won. Against all odds, against a powerful, ruthless enemy, their small, isolated community had prevailed. The valley was theirs. Their promise was secure. Caleb Thorne and his remaining men surrendered without a fight, their bluster gone, replaced by sullen resentment as the territorial marshals disarmed them and placed them under arrest. Josiah King, far away in the capital, found his empire crumbling, his reputation destroyed, his future now one of legal battles and likely prison. The reign of the cattle baron was over. In the midst of the celebration, Dr. Hayes sought out Nakona. He found the old wanderer sitting on his customary bluff, gazing out at the valley now bathed in the warm light of a spring sunrise, the harshness of winter finally, truly broken. "We did it, Nakona," Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion. "We won. The valley is safe." Nakona nodded slowly, a rare, faint smile touching his lips. "The seed of truth. It has taken root, Doctor. The land. It has spoken. And some have listened." He looked at Hayes, his ancient eyes holding a profound, quiet satisfaction. "Your people have learned much. They have learned to live with the valley, not just on it. They have learned that strength comes not just from fences and guns, but from unity, from respect, from courage born of shared hardship. And from you, Nakona," Hayes said sincerely. "We could not have done it without your wisdom, your guidance, your friendship." Nakona was silent for a moment. "I did what the land asked," he said simply. "The old paths needed a voice. Now, perhaps they can rest again, for a time." He rose slowly, leaning on his staff. "My journey continues, Doctor. There are other valleys, other streams that need tending, other whispers on the wind that must be heard." "Will you not stay?" Hayes asked, a sense of loss already settling in. "Share in the peace you helped create?" Nakona shook his head gently. "My place is not among houses, Doctor. It is with the stones, the trees, the silence. But I will not be far. This valley, it is part of my heart now, as I am part of its memory." He placed a hand briefly on Hayes's shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspoken connection. "Keep tending your fire, Doctor. Keep listening. The healing is never truly finished." And then, as silently as he had so often appeared, Nakona turned and walked away, melting into the morning mist that clung to the high peaks, a ghost returning to the wilderness, leaving behind a legacy of courage, wisdom, and the enduring power of an unknown hero. Redemption Creek thrived. Freed from the threat of King and the shadow of the epidemic, the community rebuilt, stronger, wiser, more deeply connected to each other and to the land that sustained them. Dr. Elijah Hayes continued to serve as their doctor, his practice forever informed by the lessons he had learned from Nakona, blending science with ancient wisdom, compassion with humility. He became a respected elder, a keeper of the valley's history, always reminding them of the fragile balance, the need for vigilance, the importance of listening to the quiet voices, both within and without. Lydia Carter returned a hero, her courage and inspiration, and eventually took over running the general store from the aging widow Thornton, becoming a central figure in the town's continued growth and prosperity. Little Hawk, his mission accomplished, returned to his own people in the high mountains, carrying with him the respect and gratitude of the settlers of Redemption Creek. The valley never forgot its mysterious benefactor. Though Nakona was rarely seen again, his presence was felt in the clarity of the creek water, in the abundance of game in the surrounding hills, in the potent herbs that grew in Sarah Slocum's thriving garden, in the stories told around winter fires. He became a legend, the unknown hero who had emerged from the wilderness to help them not just survive, but to understand the true meaning of their promise. His legacy was not in monuments or written histories, but in the health of the land, the resilience of the community, and the quiet wisdom passed down from one generation to the next. Redemption Creek had faced its darkest hours, battled enemies seen and unseen, and emerged into the light, forever changed, forever grateful, a testament to the enduring power of courage, community, and the profound healing that can occur when different worlds, different wisdoms, dare to meet. And so, the story of Redemption Creek and its battle against the plagues, both of sickness and of greed, comes to a close. A powerful reminder, isn't it, that the greatest challenges often demand more than just strength or skill. They demand humility, a willingness to learn from unexpected sources, a courage to question our own certainties. Dr. Hayes, a man of science, found his greatest ally, his most profound teacher, in Nokona, a man of ancient, earthbound wisdom. Their partnership transcended the boundaries of culture, of knowledge, of expectation, and in doing so, saved a community. It speaks to the often overlooked power of indigenous knowledge, the deep understanding of the natural world that sustained people on this continent for millennia, knowledge too often dismissed or destroyed in the relentless march of progress. Nokona wasn't just a mysterious stranger. He was a living library, a keeper of forgotten lore, a voice for the land itself. His heroism lay not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet acts of guidance, in sharing wisdom that fostered balance and healing. This tale also underscores the vital importance of community, of solidarity, in the face of overwhelming adversity. Redemption. Creek survived not because of one individual, but because, when tested, its people chose unity over division, trust over suspicion, shared struggle over individual despair. They learned that their greatest strength lay not in their fences or their firearms, but in their bonds with each other, and ultimately, with the land that gave them life. That's a truth as relevant today as it was on the harsh frontier. And finally, it's a story about the quiet, often unseen, nature of true heroism. Nokona sought no recognition, no reward. His actions were driven by a deep sense of responsibility to the land, to the balance, perhaps to a future he hoped could be healed. It reminds us that the most profound acts of courage are often performed in the shadows, without fanfare, motivated by a deep, abiding compassion and a commitment to something larger than oneself. It challenges us to look for heroes not just in the spotlight, but in the quiet corners, among those who tend the fires, who listen to the whispers of the wind, who work patiently, persistently, for healing and for justice. Out here, on the vast canvas of the American West, the stories of struggle, survival, and unexpected heroism are as plentiful as the stars in a clear night sky. They offer us lessons in courage, in resilience, in the enduring power of the human spirit to find light even in the deepest darkness. If this tale of Redemption Creek, of Dr. Rai, Hayes, and the enigmatic Nokona has touched your heart or sparked a thought, I invite you to share it. Let these voices from our past continue to resonate, to teach, to inspire. We'd be honored to hear your reflections in the comments below. What does it mean to be a healer? Where does true wisdom reside? And of course, if you wish to continue this journey with us, exploring more tales that delve into the complexities of frontier life, the moral choices, the triumphs and tragedies that shaped this nation, please do subscribe to this channel. We'll keep a seat warm for you by the fire. Until next time, friends, may you have the wisdom to listen to the quiet voices, the courage to challenge your own certainties, and the compassion to recognize the healer and the hero in unexpected forms. This is your narrator, wishing you health, harmony, and the strength to tend your own fires. Good night.